One of the fun things about video games is that everybody has their own opinions on which games are good and which games are bad. Despite this, I've found that most of the good games seem to have a general consensus where everybody is in agreement that they're good. However, there are some games where a sizable chunk of the opinions on it are either overly positive or overly negative. In a lot of cases, it has to do with expectations not being met, either based on the series' history or perhaps just in comparison to other games of the time. So what I'd like to do is talk about 5 specific games that come to mind and give the reasons for why people tend to fall on either side of the fence for these games. The first game would be Ecco the Dolphin. For the people who don't like this game, sometimes the reason is as simple as I don't want to play as a stupid dolphin, and that's that, which I always thought was kind of weird. I mean, I thought people loved dolphins. But some people also find the controls and difficulty curve of this game to be punishing. There's a lot of really precise movements required. The control for a game like this can be a little tricky with the D-pad, and if you get caught in the wrong spot, your life can drain quickly, causing you to die and get sent back to the last checkpoint, erasing a lot of the progress you might have made. Then there's the people who are in the positive camp for this game, finding it to be incredibly creative with an atmosphere and story unlike any game there's ever been. I don't want to spoil anything, but this game has some pretty wild twists later in the game. I think the quality of the music can't really be understated either, and especially with how well it ties into the vibe of the game. Not only that, but the soundtrack was completely redone for the Sega CD version, which some would argue is even better. This game is definitely one of those signature Sega trying to be creative type of games. Naturally, anytime you try something different, it's a risk because you just never know how people will react to it. Sure enough, this game is divisive. Okay, next game on the list would be Donkey Kong 64, and I think that this is a great example. This game is infamous for having a ton of collectibles in it. In fact, it has so many that it holds the world record for most collectibles in a game. Didn't know that was something the World Record Association would care about, but hey, it is. DK64 weighs in at a whopping 3,821 collectibles. For many gamers, that is just way too many. The game was also criticized for being too similar to Banjo-Kazooie instead of doing its own thing. Donkey Kong is a big enough IP that it didn't need to copy somebody else, as great of a game as Banjo-Kazooie may have been. Plus, I think some fans would have liked it to have been more closely inspired by the very popular Donkey Kong Country games. Oh, and you want to talk about divisive. Yeah, people are very love it or hate it when it comes to the DK rap. It's got a lot of personality, that's for sure. And that's a big part of why the people who love the game love it. The game features 5 different playable Kongs, some of which were new to the game, and they all play differently. The problem with this for some people though is that they all had their own separate collectibles as well, and most infamous of all was the different colored bananas. Each colored banana could only be picked up by a certain Kong who the color corresponded to. For example, Donkey Kong could collect the yellow bananas and Diddy Kong could collect the red bananas. If you had the wrong character, you would see where the bananas were, but you couldn't actually collect them. That rubbed a lot of players the wrong way. If I find a banana, why can't I pick it up? Not only that, but you couldn't switch characters on the fly either. You had to find a character select barrel in order to switch. So there was a lot of backtracking through all the levels in order to collect everything. Of course, the people who love the game don't mind any of this stuff. People really liked some of the new characters, I liked Lanky Kong myself, and the fact that it was based on Banjo-Kazooie wasn't necessarily a negative if you liked that style of game. And more collectibles? Heck, if you like collectathons, then the more the merrier, I suppose. And it's not like you had to collect every last single item in order to beat the game. Fun little fact though, as a kid I collected every single item in the game without a strategy guide or any help from friends. No idea how or why I did that, but I did. Okay, for the next game on the list, we're sticking with Rareware and the Grim Reaper of video games, Battletoads. Probably one of the most infamous games of all time for its difficulty. For a lot of people, this equates to it being a bad game. People also criticize it for switching up what you're doing, as almost every stage has some new idea of gameplay that gets introduced with even some new mechanics as well, which funny enough is also something it gets praised for. The game starts out with some pretty straightforward beat-em-up gameplay, luring a lot of unsuspecting gamers into the idea that's what the entire game might be like. But then you quickly realize that every single stage forces you to figure out how to master it in a different way from the last one, with stage 3, the infamous Turbo Tunnel, coming along and really setting the tone that, hey, this game is going to do a lot of different stuff and it's all going to be difficult. Now, one of the biggest points of contention is that some people feel all the new mechanics introduced throughout the game are what make the game great, arguing that the people who criticize it just suck at it and need to get better. Actually, that would be an interesting question to ask. Is there anybody who loves Battletoads but can't get past the speeder stage? I feel like the only people who love this game are the people who are good at it. Alright, moving on to the next game, which would be Castlevania Dracula X for the Super Nintendo. When it comes to this game, there are two main criticisms I tend to see. The biggest and most obvious one is that it is not as good as the Rondo of Blood game that it was marketed to be like. The other criticism is that it's not as good as the Super Castlevania 4 game that came before it on the same system. The funny thing is, even most fans of the game agree with those two criticisms. The difference between the people who love and hate this game seems to come from how far they take their disappointment. The people who like the game seem to have an understanding that even though the game shares a lot of similarities to the PC Engine game Rondo of Blood, it really is its own unique game. And even though it may not be as good as Rondo of Blood, it's still a solid game, and anybody who likes the Castlevania games of that era will probably get a lot of enjoyment out of it. It's well made for what it is. As for the people who don't like the game, I think they just feel too burned by the way the game was marketed, and its shortcomings in comparison to Rondo of Blood are just way too much of a deal breaker. Really, the best way to try to enjoy this game is to just separate it from Rondo of Blood as much as you can. Okay, the fifth and final game that I'll be talking about is Sonic CD. Some people think it's the best Sonic game ever made, and some people think it's complete trash. Kind of a big difference, right? Well, there's a lot that goes into why this is the case. First of all, it's very different from the other classic 2D Sonic games that came out around the same time. Instead of a more straightforward get from point A to point B approach, the game now adds in an extra dynamic of time travel and destroying robot transporters before you reach the end, at least if you want to get the Chaos Emeralds. The way this manifests itself into the gameplay is by requiring you to find a time travel post for the past and then get your speed up high enough for long enough to time travel. The stages are designed to accommodate this now as well, with many different opportunities to build up speed integrated into the levels. For fans of the game, this can feel much more involved and rewarding than the more traditional Sonic games. And sure, some of the appeal probably comes from the feeling of, oh my goodness, it's a game that not many people knew about back in the day, and it's a different kind of 2D Sonic game. Because here's the thing, the critics describe the level design of the stages as a scrambled, jumbled up mess that looks like some hyperactive kid got his hands on a level editor and just went nuts with it. I've also seen a lot of people criticize the time warping and objective-based stuff in the game as being really convoluted, confusing, and, well, just not fun. It's just the type of experience that's either going to click with you or not, and you may find yourself just wanting to play the more traditional Sonic games if it doesn't. Alright, so that does it for the games that I wanted to cover for now, but of course there are plenty of other games that would fall into the category of games that are very divisive. Some of the sequels on NES definitely come to mind, like Zelda 2, Castlevania 2, Mario 2, so on and so forth. If you can think of any other games that would be good examples, be sure to list them down in the comments. Also, I'd be curious what side of the fence you fall on for the games that I talked about, or if you're a complete freak and have a very neutral, rational opinion. And if you're wondering, I'm personally a fan of all the games I talked about because I wouldn't own them otherwise. Alright, so whatever your thoughts are, be sure to leave them down below, and I will see ya in the next video.